Scholars. It's Mr. Porter. Today we're going to discuss what eventually led to the fall of the Roman Empire, the end of it all. And this thing we're going to talk about today, although it seemed at the time like a great idea to help stabilize and make sure everything stayed upright with the empire, ended up leading to its downfall, even if indirectly. So we mentioned last time how the Roman Empire was in a state of gradual decline. We talked about with emperors like Commodus, the man who renamed everybody after himself and all of the days, all the months after himself and everything like that, that Rome sort of saw this collection of insane emperors, basically, who just took things from bad to worse one after the other. And it was in a state of decline. Now, I don't mean to go on and say that every Roman emperor was just a lunatic. That isn't the case. However, in general, they were not good, and it sort of led to Rome being kind of a miserable place. Although Rome...
Jake Garcia, to the front office, please. Jake Garcia, you are leaving for the day.
Although Rome was still a huge country and had access to a vast amount of military power as well as great wealth, in general, the state of the Roman Empire was going slowly downhill, and it would be for the rest of its existence, or most of the rest of its existence, but we'll get into that. So I want to sort of lead off this little bit of a lesson by talking about an emperor named Diocletian. So Emperor Diocletian, he was a military man. And this started a period of time where the emperors were no longer seen mostly as political entities, but rather they were military people who the various generals of the military would say, hey, we like this person for emperor. And because of that, because the military generals had so much power, the actual the political side of things wouldn't have the ability to really say much. They couldn't say, no, we don't like that emperor, or this isn't that's not the person that we would have voted for, or whatever, because ultimately whoever controls the military controls the people. And I know that's a really sad sentiment, but even today it's true. If you think about it, we're very blessed to live in a place where the military sort of keeps its hands off of of regular daily life and is not used as a weapon against our own citizens very frequently. However, back then that was not the case, and generally speaking, whoever controlled the military could control Rome. So you found a series of generals who became emperors because they were the most popular generals. They were the ones that were liked by the troops and the ones who held the most power. And so they became the emperor. And it sort of became a what we today think of like a dictatorial type of setup where someone would come in having absolute control of the military and then sort of take over the country. But Diocletian was the first of these militaristic style generals, or rather emperors. Luckily, though, for Rome, at least for a little while, Diocletian was a very bright person, and he was really good at running the empire. And we discussed in the last lesson some of the difficulties of maintaining the Roman Empire, and I have this map here behind me to kind of talk about it. If you were in my class the last couple days, you got the same spiel, but I just wanted to look at it one more time. So I'm not sure if the camera can see this. You might not be able to see, but up at the top here is England, and all the way over here we have Iran, the Afghanistan, Pakistan area over here. So the Roman Empire was really huge. It covered all of this area, and one of the difficulties that the emperors had in maintaining it was that there was just so much space with so many different people and so many different types of people. You have a clash of cultures and just things that didn't mesh well. They found that it was also difficult to maintain peace, especially through legal terms in the sense of passing laws, because it was difficult to pass one set of laws that would apply equally to everyone across your entire empire. So Diocletian, he sort of and before I move on, actually, another difficulty of having it be so big was the difficulty of maintaining it with your military. Essentially, the Romans were faced with enemies on just about every side of the empire. No matter which way you looked on the border, there were enemies there. So they had a military difficulty maintaining this amount of space too, because they would have to march troops from end to end of the empire. So the Roman soldiers were constantly weakened and tired and didn't have great funding to supply them with better supplies. So they ended up in a lot of difficulty there. Okay, so Diocletian now was the emperor, and he saw that there were these issues, mainly with the size of the empire being too big, and there not being any real way to sort of patrol it with the military units that they had available. Another issue that was cropping up frequently is that the Roman emperors prior to him typically liked to sort of go into battle with their troops. It added a sense of legitimacy to their title as emperor. It made them look like they were strong and capable, rather than just hiding back in Rome and sort of saying, hey, all you generals, you go fight this war, and I'm going to sit here and enjoy life as the emperor. Okay, so Diocletian, he now, because the emperors liked to travel at the head of their military units, but they could only be in one place at one time, they faced an issue, which was that Rome often was fighting more than one enemy on one side of the country at any given moment. So, because the emperors could only be in one place at one time, a lot of times military generals in other parts of the empire would win a particularly heroic battle or something and be named emperor in the absence of the actual emperor, and then there would all of a sudden be a power struggle to say, okay, well, who's the real emperor here? Is it this person who's been the emperor already, or this new person who's now claiming to be the emperor? I know in our minds it's kind of weird to think of that as being any sort of actual claim on the throne. Like, well, of course, the person who just rose up and said, I'm the new emperor now, isn't really the emperor. But back then, this was a legitimate concern. And so it was a real problem. And many, many emperors' lives were cut short because they had been, trying to do things with their troops, and then suddenly in another part of the empire somewhere, all of a sudden a new emperor pops up, and then a war happens to decide who should actually be the emperor, and a lot of emperors died that way. Now Diocletian, though, he sort of had the ability to back up and look at the overall picture and say, okay, what we have is not working. The empire is going down the drain. We are just, we're losing emperors, we're losing territory, we're losing money. Our people are not happy, our troops are not happy. And he came up with a solution. And this can be considered a radical solution by some, but it ended up saving the Roman Empire for definitely in the short term, but also ended up preserving the legacy of the Roman Empire for quite a long time into the future, even after the main body of the empire was gone. So Diocletian's solution to this issue was to split the Roman Empire into 4 pieces. And so he designed it so that the eastern half of the empire and the western half of the empire each had an Augustus, or what we would think of today as the emperor. So they each had someone who was the actual emperor of it. And then just under them, they had someone whose rank was called Caesar, which was basically a junior emperor, if you will. So then the eastern half and the western half were each split into 2. So now there was 4 pieces of the Roman Empire, and the Augustus, or the one who was claimed to be the emperor of the eastern half or the western half, sort of ruled over the whole thing, but really mainly just stayed in one part, while the other part was ruled by the Caesar, or the junior emperor. So it's kind of a weird idea, but let's look again at this map. And instead of looking up here at the top, this time we're going to look down here at this more colorful version. So you can see that there are 4 colors here. There's sort of this pink color here, this green color, and then here's a blue color here, and an orange here. So this is a map of what they call the Tetrarchy, which is basically, it's a Greek term that translates into, it's a leadership by 4 people. So the pink and the green sections here made up the eastern part of the empire, and the blue and the orange or brown sections here made up the western part of the empire. So, and then each of those was divided in half again, as you can see. So this section had an emperor, and this section had an emperor. Now, this worked really well for Diocletian, because what that meant was that each person's little section of the empire was much smaller. So they didn't have to have only one, military force to patrol all of the whole thing. Instead, they could just say, okay, we have our military, these guys have their military, these guys have their military, and they have their military. So then they were able to operate in their little area with much better effectiveness. And it also removed the problem of having an emperor crop up somewhere else in the empire, because as it so happened, each of these sections was near to a popular battleground, let's say, somewhere where the enemies were very heavy. So this pink section mostly concerned itself with the enemies on this side. The green section mostly concerned itself with enemies up here. The blue section mostly fought the enemies over here. And the brown section fought enemies up here, up in this way, and then down here. So they sort of divided up the enemies so that they could best use their resources instead of having to travel all over the place, back and forth. And they avoided the whole 2 emperor situation by already having 2 emperors. And because of this, there wasn't really enough wiggle room for somebody to suddenly rise up and say, no, actually, I'm the emperor. So they avoided a lot of hassle and confusion by splitting it up into 4 pieces. One thing to note about the Tetrarchy, the way that Diocletian set it up, is that Rome, the city, for the first time in the history of the Roman people, was no longer the capital of the country. Each of these sections had their own capital. This section here had a capital right here. The green section had a capital here. The blue section had their capital up here. And this section had a capital right here. So you can see none of those are really near Rome. Rome being right here. Rome still was a very important city within the overall country, but they reorganized their capital cities to be closer to where the action was happening with the fighting. Like I said, these were Diocletian was a general, and the people that he appointed were also generals, so to them, their main concern was being able to defeat Rome's enemies. So they still remained the Roman Empire, but Rome, the city, was no longer the capital and kind of ceased to be important from that point on. Well, okay, I don't want to say ceased to be important, but it was not nearly as important as it had been before. And this was a point of concern for a lot of people, especially those people who were, lifelong politicians, the senators and everything who had been living in Rome they were used to this idea of Rome being the center of the world, and now it no longer was. It was, at best, an important piece of this little chunk of the empire there. It wasn't even that important to the other three parts of the empire, which ended up causing some problems for the Romans. But Diocletian felt like this was the best way to do this. By splitting the empire up into 4 slices and moving the capitals around so they can be closer to what's happening, he felt like they could alleviate a lot of the problems that the empire had been facing before, and in fact, it did. The Tetrarchies, or the leadership by 4 people, was very successful. In fact, Rome flourished for a time, and it looked like they would climb out of their decline. Unfortunately for Rome and, for the Tetrarchy and for the empire as a whole, Diocletian's idea only worked for about 20 years while Diocletian was still alive. One of the biggest issues facing the empire in its previous state is that there was not necessarily a clear line of succession for who would become the next emperor. And there was also not really any real way to get out of being an emperor except through either death by natural causes or assassination. And as sad and unfortunate as it is to say it that way, that's just the truth. Roman emperors typically did not just resign or step down from their position. They were forced to give it up either by death through old age or through murder. And Diocletian also saw this as a big problem, and it was a problem. In between the time, so I mentioned in a previous lesson that we had the year of the 4 emperors. This was before the Flavian Dynasty lesson, where we talked about there was a single year in which there were 4 different emperors selected during that year, and 3 of them had been assassinated. The 4th one did last a while. That was Vespasian. So in that one single year, there were 4 emperors. Now, after the reign of Emperor Commodus, there was a brief time when there was a year of 5 emperors. Not to be outdone by the earlier version of themselves, the Romans continued to choose the emperors poorly or just be in a state of upheaval. And after that, a little ways, there was also the year of 6 emperors, and it was a total mess. Diocletian saw that, and he didn't want that to continue happening. So he, along with his other co-emperor, they put in a system whereby the emperors could peacefully step down and retire from being the emperor. Now, this didn't, like I said, it didn't last a super long time, but he did put a system in place that shows that he was thinking about this sort of thing, just like how we have a system for our president to say, okay, I'm not the president anymore, and it's your turn. And generally, this happens without a lot of chaos or anything. Life continues regularly for all the people. So in this case, Diocletian said, okay, each emperor. So remember, in this case, the emperor of the eastern half lived in this pink section. He was the ruler of the pink section. The junior emperor for the eastern half was in the green section. Over here, the emperor for the western half was in the blue section, and the junior emperor was in the orange section. So Diocletian was over here, and he and the other guy in the blue section, they said, okay, after 20 years, we're going to no longer be the emperor. We're going to retire. We're going to be done with our career. And the plan was for these two, the ones in the green and the orange section, to step up to being the new emperors. And then they were going to elect new junior emperors to take over in these places. And then these two would be the emperors for 20 years. And then when they were done, they would step down. These two would step up and be the emperors, and then they would elect new junior emperors in these areas. So they would sort of leapfrog over each other like that. In theory, this was excellent, and it worked perfectly at the beginning. Diocletian and his partner, Maximian was his name, his co-emperor, they both stepped down after 20 years and they retired. They elevated the junior emperors to be the new emperors, and the junior emperors selected the new people the people who had been the junior emperors, the new emperors. They selected people to fill in the spot of the junior emperors, and everything was fine. But there came an issue when the son of Maximian and the son of Diocletian, actually, they did not like that they had not been selected as the new junior emperors. They felt like it was their responsibility or their privilege, I guess, is a better way of saying that. It was their privilege to be the new junior emperors after their fathers had stepped down from being the old emperors. And they didn't like that they had been left out of the leadership there. If they had just gone along with the way things were supposed to be according to the new regulations that they had set up, maybe things would have turned out differently for the Roman Empire, and maybe, who knows, maybe it would still be standing today. Not necessarily super likely, but who knows? It could be. Unfortunately, though, those two decided that they were going to cause a ruckus, which, to make a long story short, caused a collapse of the system. It ended when one of the sons, the son of Diocletian, came and ended up sort of becoming the sole emperor again over everything. He took out a bunch of his political opponents and became the new emperor. However, this period of time, this Tetrarchy, is extremely important when discussing the decline of the Roman Empire, because although Diocletian's son did take control over both halves again and he reunited them, after they had been split, they didn't really ever come back together, although technically they were back together for a short time. After the split, it was extremely common for the Roman Empire to be split in half. You had one half, the Eastern Roman Empire, and the other half, the Western Roman Empire. And a couple emperors would try to get them back together, but for the most part, for the rest of the Roman history, these two halves would be separated. And the split wasn't made official in terms of, okay, these are actually separate countries, until a couple, like 100 years in the future from Diocletian's time. But eventually, the split was made official, two separate halves, and they would never come back together again.